Hello and welcome to the Early Wheeling Podcast, Road Stories. I'm your host, Daryl Dremel, and today on Early Wheeling, I will be talking to Tom Madigan. Now, Tom, if you don't know, is an accomplished author. He's been involved with the motorsports really since its inception, many, many years ago, since the 50s anyway. He has written books such as The Snake vs. Mongoose, How a Rivalry Changed Drag Racing History, and Boss, the Bill Stroppe Story, which we're going to touch on today, Edelbrock Made in the USA, Fuel and Guts, just to name a few. And he's also the former editor of Off-Road magazine. And so now I welcome Tom, and a huge thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I know we're going to talk about Baja and some of the other important factors in off-roading, but I thought I'd maybe do a little piece on where it all came from and how this thing really kind of got started. And basically, I'm going to stick with California and Arizona because that's the area where I'm more familiar with and actually where a lot of the history came from.
Absolutely.
Where this stuff all started, of course, was after World War II, because a lot of the GIs that came back had been introduced to the Jeep, and there were a lot of surplus Jeeps available in the States when they got back, and in fact, they refer to those as G.I. Joe's limos, and guys would buy them really, really reasonable and, tinker with them, and they started going out in the Mojave Desert, exploring, looking for old ghost towns, that kind of stuff, and then they started, the same with Arizona, they would get out, they called them desert rats, they'd be out there exploring, getting away from the city and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And as the idea of four-wheel drive grew, it started to pick up some interest. And before the Bronco was even introduced in the late 50s, a fellow named Mark Smith, who was an avid off-roader, came up with an idea to do what was called the Jeeper Jamboree. And what it consisted of is a 65-mile journey through the worst situations you could possibly imagine through the Sierra Nevada mountains on a thing called the Rubicon Trail.
Oh, yeah.
And where that came from was the Rubicon Trail went from Georgetown, California to up near Lake Tahoe. It was an old stagecoach route, and there was a huge earthquake. And all these big boulders and rocks and things just closed the trail. So it lay dormant for years and years and years. And then the four-wheel drive guys, came out there and they started doing this. And it was a big hit because it was a challenge, and the guys that did it really kind of enjoyed it. There was also another fella, a pioneer, I guess. His name was Brian Chichua, and Brian was a Jeep dealer. Mm-hmm. And he came up with the idea of, hey, why don't we go to the Riverside riverbed? There was in Riverside, California, there's a river that was dry 99% of the year and wide and all sandy and ruddy and all that. So he developed what was called the Riverside Grand Prix, and what that was is you could bring out your four-wheel drive whatever, and now there had also been introduced the dune buggy kind of thing. A fellow named Myers, a vehicle called the Myers Mank, which was used Volkswagen power, and all this stuff was kind of going together sort of simultaneously, sort of all over the place, and it had no real structure to it, but Brian came up with the Riverside race, and guys like Vic Hickey and Dick Seepeck, and actually, I think Steve McQueen ran in it. Jim Garner ran in it, movie actor. Stuff was growing a little bit here and a little bit there. And then in 1962, I think it was. There was a deal where the motorcycle guys got involved because motorcycles out in California, Arizona, they were doing a lot of hare and hound racing, which meant you could race across the desert from point A to point B, fastest guy there won the event, and so that was kind of a deal that they were doing. So there was a couple of famous desert racers named the Eakins brothers, Bud and Dave Eakins. They came up with a scheme, a challenge, and what they were going to do was they were going to ride from Tijuana, Mexico to La Paz.
Right.
And how they did it was they would go into a post office and have an envelope postmarked, and then they would put it in their pocket, and they would ride fast as they could down to La Paz, go in the post office and have it postmarked. Mm-hmm. And that would give you the time that it took to do that. And so they did a run back in '62, and they went from Tijuana to La Paz in 39 hours.
Yeah, wow.
And okay, that was fine, except that the car guys wanted to do it. And so Bruce Meyer, the guy that invented or had the Myers Manx, and a couple of his buddies decided, they were going to do it. And so they went down and did a little better time, and then it kind of got to the point where these people were going down there just trying to see if they could beat the time. There was no real race involved. There was no real structure involved or anything. It was just a bunch of guys doing their thing. And then I guess, if I remember correctly, the two fellow friends of mine, actually, a guy named Spence Murray and a guy named Ralph Poole, they were both car magazine guys. They took an American Motors Rambler, just a stock two-wheel drive Rambler, and went on down from to La Paz, and they did it with like just a two-wheel drive vehicle. So you could see that this thing was kind of growing. And then when Ford came along with the introduction of the Bronco, they wanted to get some ink, and so they introduced the Bronco, I guess, in 1965. Mm-hmm. And shortly thereafter, a fellow named Ed Perlman, he was a florist, but a really avid off-road guy. And him and several other avid off-road guys got together and decided that they would run the Tijuana to La Paz thing as not as much as an event, but more than one car at a time. I think they ran 3 just to see who could win, who could get there the fastest. And so they did that, and then Perlman came up with the idea, well, hey, wait a minute. Why don't we go to the Mexican government and see if we can actually organize an event that would be a real event and get entrance and see what happens. And the original plan, and Ed, who has passed away now, told me personally that his first idea was to have a race and everybody kick in $50, and when they got to the down to La Paz, they'd have a big party, and that would be it. But it worked out a little different, and somewhere in October of '67, I think it was, Ed Perlman formed an organization called NORA, which was the National Off-Road Racing Association, and he got about 68, 69 cars to run the event. And you got to remember that there were Jeeps and all kinds of Broncos, of course, pickup trucks, a lot of different kinds of buggies. There was a Citroen, and it was like there was not a real course even. It was, hey, see you when I see you. And these guys would all go flying down there, and they had modified some of the cars. Stroppe, I know, did put 2 shocks on each wheel and so on and so forth. But that was kind of the very first real Baja event. and Stroppe had a Bronco in it, and I think Ray Harvick drove it. And the point of the whole matter was that off-roading was catching on. And, you know, you were getting International Harvester, Jeep, American Motors, Bronco, then Blazer was going to come out, and Dodge was going to come out. So that the factories knew that four-wheel drive off-roading was going to be the next big thing, and they kind of were all interested in this deal. So as the history went by, the idea of running from, it actually ended up, they moved the race to Ensenada, and the NORA guys at Perlman, 68, 69, they moved to, starting position was in Ensenada. And also, they actually made a course. They designed a course with, some type of markings and arrows or whatever, so that the entrance actually had a way to go. They also enforced safety that, you had to have roll bars, helmets, just like a regular race car. And so that's kind of the way it materialized. And, of course, Bill Stroppe, being the back door of Ford Motor Company's West Coast racing area, he was deeply involved in the Pan American Road Race in the 50s, and he was deeply involved in West Coast NASCAR stock car racing. Him and Parnelli had run it together, and he was the logical choice for Ford to want to come out and run the Bronco. Mm-hmm. So the idea was Ford Motor Company sent out, and I don't know the exact number, but I'm going to say 3 or 4 stock Broncos to Stroppe shop in Long Beach and said, hey, do what you want to do, put them in events, whatever you want them, modifications, but can we enter them in, some of the big events and things. So there was some type of a press event, and I honestly don't remember what that event was, but there's a lot of magazine guys and off-road guys and people from the various car manufacturers hanging out. Parnelli was there, and Stroppe went up to Parnelli and, hey, I want to build a Bronco. Why don't we go off-road racing, blah, blah, blah. And Parnelli, I'm not going to do that. I'm involved in Indy and dirty. And, I get all dirty and you got to camp out. I don't want to do that. And so Stroppe, knew Parnelli well enough to know, oh, you're right, Parnelli. Probably you wouldn't want to do it because, you're really not maybe in as good shape as you want to be. And, it takes a lot of arm strength. And, I don't blame you. Well, that just lit a candle under Parnelli, and he went, bananas, and of course, and went, give me that car, I'll drive it. So they decided to, I guess, put together a kind of make a stock Bronco, but modify it for off-road events. By then there was a couple other races in the desert. So anyway, they put together a Bronco, and Parnelli took it out, and he'd kill it. He would kill him. He was so hard, he drove so hard that the front suspension system and stuff, he just beat it to death. So they tried their best to get the weight out of that front end, but it just didn't work. So as Ford Motor Company got more involved, Bunky Knudsen, who was a big wheel back then, and he had a lot to do with Ford racing, decided that they would offer a kit that they would take the front I-beam suspension from an F-150 Ford pickup and modify it and offer it to a Bronco guys that raced so they could take the front differential drive shaft out, run it as a two-wheel drive vehicle, lighten the front end up, more suspension, and put 4 shocks on and see if they could keep the car together. Well, it never went anywhere. For the company, Ford Motor Company, didn't allow them to produce this kit. So Bunky sent a couple of kits to Stroppe and said, hey, see what you can do. So they actually built another Bronco using the front high beams, and they modified the car. They set the engine back a little. They put a plastic body on it. They cut, reduced weight, and on and on and on. You could say they built a real race car motor, something you'd find in a sprint car. And they put that in there. And at first they called it the Crazy Colt. Then it was changed to the Pony. And it was what it was a highly modified Bronco. Parnelli was still too rough. He ran so hard that they just couldn't seem to put together a car that would stay together for him.
Yeah.
So I guess late '69, Parnelli by this time was going, I want a car to win. I don't want to be breaking. So he had a fella work for him named Tricky Dick Russell. Dick Russell was a fantastic race car builder. And Parnelli said, I want a Bronco. I want a race car. So Dick Russell, he designed an all-new suspension system, front and rear. They built a 351 Cleveland V8. It had 400 and some horsepower. It was a real, like a circle track sprint car engine. A lot of revs, a lot of squirt, a lot of horsepower, a lot of torque. They put it in there, and they put a gigantic wing on the back, again, like a World of Outlaw car. So Parnelli could adjust the wing for downforce. There was a lot of tricks to that car, and it had full cage and race seats and everything you'd need. And of course, when Parnelli got in that thing, he stuffed Bill Stroppe in with him, and in 1970, they won the Baja 500 in 11 hours and 33 minutes. And that was the answer. So that was sort of the creation of what is now known as the Big Ole, which was sponsored by Olympia Beer, and it was a terror of off-road from that point onward. So that's kind of a background of where all this came from, and everyone else, I guess, knows the rest. Vic Hickey became the Blazer guy, and he built a lot of specialty Chevrolet vehicles. Steve McQueen drove a car called the Baja Boot that was built by Vic Hickey. Jim Garner drove a Oldsmobile, super modified Oldsmobile called the Banshee. And the Baja races just grew from 60-some entries to 300. And they had, a whole lot of different classes. And so that's kind of the history of where we're at.
What's the best MacGyver story? And by that, I mean, obviously there's breakdowns on the trail. And what to you stands out as probably one of the most ingenious ways to fix a rig while they were out there?
My wife always says Bill Stroppe could fix anything anywhere. They had a lot of vapor lock, in the early Broncos. They would get hot, vapor lock, and Stroppe came up with a thing. He'd have a roll of aluminum foil, and he'd wrap the gas lines in aluminum foil. They also came up with an idea of putting ice out of the cooler, their water cooler that they carry, and they'd grab a handful of ice, and they made a special little container that would run the fuel line through it, so it would stay vapor lock. Guys, four-wheel drive, they pull the front drive line out and throw it away and just run the rear end. They wouldn't try to go four-wheel drive. Guys, in Baja, it was nothing for them to pull into a Mexican guy's ranch and, borrow tools or whatever, tires. It was like you had to carry enough stuff with you to fix stuff. They also had sort of developed chase vehicles that would come down and chase after the race vehicles, and anything. There were a lot of incidents in the early days of the Baja race where people would crash and stuff, and there were a couple of doctors who were off-road guys, and I remember distinctly that a couple of them would deliberately run a two-seat buggy in the events, and instead of racing, they would more or less chase the race cars, and if there was a motorcycle guy down or a buggy guy down or a serious accident, they had some type of, pretty serious first aid kit, and they would render assistance, because when you were out in the wilderness, you were out in the wilderness. So I know Parnelli and Stroppe ran out of fuel in the Big Ole, and they stopped a couple of guys, Mexican guys, and Parnelli pulled a $20 bill out of his pocket and said, "Hey, man, some gasolina, right?" And they went, "Oh, yeah. So they had I guess a couple gallon can of gas. The problem was instead of pouring it in their fuel cell, they poured it in their drinking water tank, and that didn't work out too good. So they did manage to save enough to put it in the fuel cell so they could get down and win the race. But I know of a fact that a motorcycle guy, Malcolm Smith, was going across El Diablo Dry Lakes at night, flat out, and hit a coyote, and they knocked them both out. Uh-huh. And he had to lay in the desert till he came to, and kind of looked over, and the coyote came to, and he kind of picked his bike up, and the coyote kind of picked himself up and went trotting off. Stuff like that happened all the time.
That's hilarious and tragic and amazing all at the same time. Now, Parnelli Jones and Bill Stroppe, they had a unique relationship with each other. What's one thing that nobody really knows about Parnelli Jones and Bill Stroppe together?
Well, I think their closeness came from running in Baja and pre-running, and both Parnelli and Stroppe had a tremendous background in Indianapolis. I don't know if a lot of people know this or not, but Bill Stroppe was a crew member with Clay Smith, who was the crew chief on the Troy Ruttman Indy car owned by J.C. Agajanian, and it was the last dirt track car to win Indianapolis in 1952. So Stroppe went way back, and I think Parnelli enjoyed that history. He loved Stroppe because Stroppe was the real deal. But I think one of the things that no one would ever know about is that once they got in Big Ole and started down the road, if you met Bill Stroppe in Long Beach at his shop in his office, he was the sweetest guy you have ever met. He just the most courteous, the most respectful, on and on and on. And once they got in that car and he got strapped in, he would boss Parnelli. He'd bark at Parnelli. He'd yell at him for going into corners, holes too deep, browbeat, cussing, yelling. They had a hysterical relationship when they were racing, because he'd want Parnelli to slow down, and Parnelli had no way to stand on the gas. And I know I rode with Parnelli, gave me a ride in Big Ole one time, and we were going down a dirt road, and he was going 40 miles an hour faster than I ever thought of going. And he'd pitch that thing into a sprint car slide, and you just keep your mouth shut because you had no idea how good a driver he was. And so that was one of the things that I think nobody really ever saw, but Stroppe used to tell me stories about. He'd grab Parnelli's shirt, side of his driving suit, and he'd be shaking him and go, there's a big hole coming, slow down, blah, blah. And Parnelli would just, glare at him and stand on the gas. So that was kind of a pretty funny thing that they had going. Then at the end of the race, nobody would ever know. They'd be talking to each other.
Bruce Myers talked about one time how he made the mistake of not letting Parnelli Jones by on a narrow roadway, and Parnelli Jones returned the favor by breaking his legs. Is this a true story? Have you heard this?
If you had a buggy, you had that Volkswagen in the back, and a lot of them had exhaust pipes that stuck out up in the air. Parnelli had come up behind those guys at Big Ole, and he had a big push bar on the front, and he'd bang them, boom, get out of the way. And if they didn't, the second time he banged them. You know what I mean? And he had quite a few hard feelings about that, but he wanted to give you a chance, move over, I'm faster, coming through, and if you didn't, he'd move you. So I don't know if that was one of, the things that happened, but that happened a lot. And the buggy guys, they were faster than a lot of the four-wheel drive cars, but they weren't faster than Big Ole. And so he passed a lot of guys. And after a while, they finally got to the point where when Parnelli came up and give them a tap, they'd move over.
Now, what was Big Ole's top speed, do you know?
I'm going to say about across Diablo Dry Lake, probably 125, 130, something like that, 120.
Wow.
Somewhere up there. Didn't get out there, and run pretty stout.
Now, you actually knew Steve McQueen, and you had some interactions with him. Let's talk a little bit about Mr. McQueen and what he was all about. We all know he was an adamant car guy and a race car driver and very into the motor scene.
Well, the story that I went pre-running a couple of times, and Steve was down there with Vic Hickey. We were in Ensenada, and I came out heading for the pit area, and Steve was walking along with had his helmet, his fire suit on. He had his helmet in his hand. And I looked over at him, I said hello and smiled and all that. And I said, well, what do you think, Steve? What do you think about today? And he just looked at me and he goes, it's just a drive down the road, man. And that always stuck in my mind, because he was a really good race driver. I mean, that was no joke. He could get out there and run. And he was also just an absolutely excellent motorcycle rider. Steve McQueen could run desert surprisingly good. And with the race car, he ran Daytona. He ran Peter Revson down there. And also, there was a fella, and I don't know how many people know this, but there was a fella named Tony Nancy who was a really, really famous interior leather guy. He did interiors. He did race car interiors. He also was a top fuel runner back in the early 60s, I guess, mid-60s, 70s. Tony Nancy was a pretty famous dragster driver. And he and Steve McQueen were very, very good friends. And in fact, as a matter of fact, Tony Nancy actually worked for Steve running part of his business when Steve McQueen had a company called Solar Plastics, and they made seats for dune buggies. Steve would go down to Tony's shop down at Woodman Avenue in Sherman Oaks and hang out. And I'll tell you, there was nothing better than, some evening, 9 or 10 o'clock, Tony had his shop closed, and he had a shop next door where he did all the race car stuff. And McQueen would come down, and we'd bench race in there. And he was just the kind of guy you'd like to hang with. And when he was Steve McQueen, the movie actor, that was a completely different story. But when he was Steve McQueen, the race car guy, he was a good guy. He had a hangar at the Santa Paula Airport, and he bought a Stearman two-wing airplane from a friend of mine. It was a 100-point airplane, a beautiful old Stearman mail plane. And Steve flew it, and my wife and I went to Santa Paula one day and spent the day taking pictures of Steve, getting in, flying it, having his old flying suit on, and some of the stuff with the guy who owned the plane. And I had a poster that I wanted him to sign for me, and I forgot it. It was under the seat of my truck. And we spent the day in the hangar talking about the old days in Baja and all that, and I never got to see him again. And he never signed the poster, and it was something that I really regret because, after that he became very ill, and then, he passed away.
You definitely have lived a life that a lot of people would envy. And out of all of those memories that you have of racing and personal life and your interactions with all of these people in this industry, what would be your fondest memory of that, or some of your fondest memories?
Well, my wife and I's relationship with Jim Garner means a whole lot to me. Jim was a long-time, really close friend of ours. We played around on Rockford Files with him, and he was just a real friend. Him and I, he did the intro or the foreword for my Tony Nancy book. We did a lot of magazine covers in the early days, off-road. When I was editor of Off-Road Magazine, I think Jim and I did 2 or 3 covers together. I will tell you one hysterical story, and I don't know if anybody will even believe this, but he had a pickup truck that his dad, supposedly in the series, with Noel Berry was his dad. It was the truck his dad drove. It was a Chevy pickup with a roll bar and stuff in it. Well, the truck was built by Vic Hickey, and I had that truck for about a month or 2 before Jim had it. So we decided that we were going to do a cover. Oh, man, it'd be great. And the theme of the thing was Jim Garner, a real off-roader. And I was going to build a campfire, and we were going to have a sleeping bag in the truck parked behind, and Jim was going to have his cowboy hat. It was going to be a setup. So, okay, fine. So we decided to do it. And a long time ago, up near Solvang, there was a friend of Vic Hickey's who owned a ranch that became the Reagan Ranch. So we go over there, we find this location, and we're going to build a campfire. So I told Jim, I go, get in the sleeping bag thing and put your head on we had a saddle that he was going to lay against like a, pillow and stuff. So my cameraman and I were trying to build this fire, and it was misty. It was up by Santa Barbara, so it was kind of cold, cool, and misty, and we couldn't. So I get the idea. I got a good idea. I'll go over to the truck. It's got a auxiliary fuel tank on it. I'll just drain a cup of gas out of the tank and throw it on the fire. Make it, we'll get it going. So I get a little bit of gas. I put it in a can, and I go over to the fire, and Jim's laying down there and everything, and this little dopey fire is just kind of trickling along, I take the can of gas and I throw it on the fire, and it goes boom! Only I missed the bulk of the fire, and I threw some of the gas on Jim Garner's pants, and they ignited, so we had to put his pants out, and we shot the cover, and he just wouldn't leave it alone, He was yelling and moaning about me ruining his pants. That was kind of a funny story, but Jim was, to me personally, and to my wife Darlene, was one of the closest celebrity friends we ever had.
Well, did you ever end up buying him a new pair of pants, or did he just...
No, he, by the time the end of the day was, he forgave me. It was hysterical. He was a very funny guy, and just, you get him away from the Hollywood scene, and he was just, really, really good guy.
Did he ever let you drive the Banshee?
No, I was in the car a couple of times to see what it was like. What's really funny about it is that the Banshee changed appearances and things. There were several different variations of it, and so no, I never did. I got to ride with Jim in an F-150 that he drove at Baja.
Well, Tom, I'm not going to take up any more of your time. Thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing your memories, and I hope to be in touch with you. I could talk with you all day and listen to your stories because they are truly amazing, and I know that everybody will thoroughly enjoy them. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Hey, Thank you very much, Daryl, for having me. I enjoyed it.
And I'd like to thank you, the listener, for tuning into this podcast. This was Early Wheeling Road Stories, the podcast. And thank you for joining me, and we'll talk to you soon. Copyright 2018, 3DB Productions.